Reverend Rosemarie, Adcock, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So a little informal chat here about the topic of spiritual religious consciousness. And I found out recently these are kind of mutually exclusive apparently because I've been a religious person. I go to church. I've gone to church my entire life, and I like to think I have a spiritual side, and I also have quite an extensive metaphysical library, and I recently joined Connecting Consciousness in Illinois. So I recently had an experience in men's Bible study where I mentioned consciousness and Christ consciousness, and I'm pretty sure they were going to excommunicate me because
Very
they
funny.
really didn't want to hear anything about anything to do with consciousness. So I guess I'm going to ask you tonight. You're the Reverend in the room, and if you can enlighten us on the topic of spiritual, religious, and consciousness, are these problematic topics and are they mutually exclusive?
I don't think that they would be mutually exclusive. It's almost like if somebody says, I have faith, and to a degree, it's what is the object of that faith? If somebody says, well, I have faith, because I have faith, something's going to happen. So they have faith in the idea of their own faith, that somehow something magical happens because they have faith, and so it will change the universe. But if we have faith in the creator of the universe, then the object of that faith is directed somewhere. So I would say if you have consciousness, what you had described as consciousness and the spiritual and religious, those things intertwine depending on what the object of that focus is.
Well, I think probably from my experience, where I've observed we run into a folly is when we make the focus ourselves. I was attending a church service recently, and they said, oftentimes we're trying to create God in our own image, instead of really acknowledging God in His own essence. Like we're trying to make God conform to our idea instead of our conforming to His idea.
Right, and I guess you could say one example of that would be somebody says, oh, I almost got into a car accident. Isn't God good? I didn't get into a car accident. Well, God's goodness doesn't depend on whether or not we got into the car accident. He is unchangeable. These attributes that are described in the scriptures, He's unchangeable, immutable, all-powerful, etc. And sometimes we want to say, well, if God does this for me, then He's okay. But if this, whatever this happens to be, doesn't happen, well, I don't know so much about Him anymore. So in that way, when somebody says, well, we can't create God in our own image, God in our own image being this being that's here to serve our purposes, our needs, felt needs, whatever that might be for the moment, which is constantly changing. Mm-hmm. In 5 years, we might need something completely different, but He never changes. And so it's almost an act of humility to sit underneath His unchanging ways of doing things. And it may not fit necessarily with the particular culture we live in, but He doesn't change. Mm-hmm. And if somebody was in communist Russia, God didn't become a communist to fit in. He doesn't change. And all these changes that happen in these nations, that happen around us, or even in our own lives, somebody who says, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to stick with this or whatever, or even the Apostle Peter, for example, where he said, oh, even if everyone else leaves you, I'll never leave you. And then Jesus said to him, by the time the cock crows in the morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. We have this idea of ourselves that we're going to do something, and it may not necessarily be the case, or we may change because of the circumstances around us, that all of a sudden we do something different than what we thought we were going to do.
Well, that's ironic, especially in the context of consciousness, because in reality, we oftentimes misjudge our own behavior. We don't even know ourselves that well. Reverend
Right.
Rosemarie, I was so intrigued. I guess that what set me off on that line of questioning was the idea that we mentioned having faith in our faith. I mean, that really sums it up very well, doesn't it? That a lot of people, myself included, we have faith in our own faith. Like that's our religion.
Right. And there are a lot of books, and I love reading motivational kind of books, it gets me out of my head, but having faith about something happening doesn't make it happen necessarily. For example, if we say, well, I have faith that God is going to say you're in business, and I have faith that God is going to do this, that, and the other thing for my business, but you stay in bed all week. Well, you have to do something to kind of partner with him in that way, but it's not the believing only that will do it. Now, again, on the other hand, there were instances where Jesus, and we talked about this just in our church service on Sunday, where Jesus had talked to the man who had a dying daughter, a dying 12-year-old daughter, Jairus.
Yes, that was part of the lectionary. So you preach from the lectionary.
Yeah, we do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so with Jairus's daughter, this little 12-year-old, well, she was a 12-year-old, but with Jairus's daughter, Jesus had said to him, if you believe, and there are many times where he said, if you believe, and then there were times when it said that he tried to minister in the town where he grew up, and nobody believed anything, and he could hardly do any miracles there. It said, except for a couple of healings, like that's small, but for him, or on the other hand, then we can look at the example of Lazarus. Lazarus did not have faith that Jesus was going to raise him from the dead because he was dead. There was no faith involved in Lazarus being raised from the dead. God, apart from Lazarus's faith, couldn't have any. He was dead. And nobody else expected it. No one had faith that he was going to raise, like Martha, when Jesus said to her, well, do you believe whatever? And she said, yeah, I believe that we'll all be raised in the resurrection. She had no concept that after Lazarus was dead, those 4 days, that Jesus was going to raise him from the dead. But she believed in Jesus, that he was the Messiah. And then Jesus, apart from what anyone else thought, did what he needed to do as a demonstration of God's power.
Yes, her faith was well-founded.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly, in him, although she wasn't sure what he was going to do.
Rosemarie, I don't know if you're familiar with Marianne Williamson.
Mm.
But she was in the Democratic national debates a number of years ago when they were trying to vet out the eventual candidate for the Democratic National Convention. And she was asked she's a spiritual person, and they asked her what she thought the biggest crisis was facing the United States. And without hesitation, she said, spiritual crisis. So do you think people's desire to be more conscious, or maybe they're hiding out in lower consciousness, is a spiritual manifestation, or is it vice versa? Does higher consciousness take us to a higher spiritual level? Which comes first?
Well, Jesus had said in his word, nobody can come to me unless the Father first draws him. And what he's saying there is, just like Lazarus was dead, that's human beings spiritually are separated from God and spiritually as good as dead. And unless God himself quickens the heart and causes life, so that, because like Isaiah said, there's none righteous, no, not one, none seek after God. They all go after their own will. None seek after God. So Jesus had said to his disciples, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. In other words, there is nothing natural in us to look for something supernatural. we've all met people who, I mean, I knew someone, a father of a friend, did not want a funeral. Absolutely refused his children and grandchildren, whatever, to do a funeral for him. He wanted no part of any of it, nothing at all. And even after his death, he had to draw a line on his atheism, and say, no, you're not going to cross this line. I don't want any part of it. And they couldn't do a memorial service, whatever. So I think if we come to realize that any seeking after God that is in our hearts is something that he puts in there, the miracle of us seeking God, I mean, other creatures don't do that. The miracle of us seeking after God is something that he creates in us, that desire, because that desire is not natural to a natural man. If we are, we're here on this planet, we're born, we live, we die, and then suddenly, it's over. And there are a lot of people in the world that believe, well, when it's done, it's over. So it's a special, I would say special, maybe position of the heart to say there's more than this. There's more than I'm born at this time, I'm going to live till this day, and then after that, my flesh is in this coffin and it'll turn into dust eventually. Leave it there long enough and that's it. A lot of us don't believe that, and it's difficult to try to find truth. So where are we putting our faith? Again, we talked about putting your faith in faith itself. If I'm positive enough and motivated enough and happy enough, I can make these things happen. That might be true to a degree, but we have to put, when we recognize that we are these finite beings and the things that are supernatural outside of the existence that we can see, we have to recognize that if we believe in a creator, that this creator made us. And just like professionally, I'm an artist, I'm a painter, just like I would make a painting, and that painting, and in the Bible, it talks about, does the clay say to the potter, why have you made me this way? We can't do that. I mean, they're so separate beings apart from one another. We can't say to God, well, you did this wrong, or you didn't make me this way, or whatever. But so your question, I guess, was more about spiritual religion. Are these things linked? I would say that they're linked, but I think that the conclusion of that pursuit is probably what's the most important. Where do we end up? What do we end up believing in?
Interesting. Reverend Rosemarie, Marcy Carmack has just joined us. Marcy is a regular at Fashion Coffee Hour, so it's a little bit different topic, fashion versus spirituality, but I guess there is some crossover.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Well,
Nice to meet you.
we were just discussing the difference between spiritual religion, and consciousness, and Rosemarie did an excellent job explaining that really it's only God's will that enables us to have any kind of inkling as to his moving in our lives. It's not something that we do through faith or having faith in our faith. But my other question was about the consciousness, because we're in this group together, Rosemarie, in Illinois, over 1,200 people. I'm just a little concerned on the consciousness, the pursuit of consciousness. Are we in danger of just, and you mentioned the word truth, of discarding current truths in pursuit of, real truths or new truths, but are they really just different truths? So is that something we need to be cautious of, the idea, as we pursue the topic of consciousness, running the folly of just discarding our current truths for some other erroneous truths?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about different kind of spiritual beings, even if you would say that, there are some that are evil, there are some that are good. And one of the things that Jesus said about Satan was he's a liar. He was a liar from the beginning. When you go to Genesis chapter 3, he said to Adam and Eve, surely you won't die. Well, physically they didn't die at that moment, but spiritually they did. And he's a deceiver. He's a murderer. He's a liar. And the only way that we're able to really discern if we're looking for God, looking for Jesus, and Jesus claimed to be God, which is why they killed him. So we would each have to make a decision in our hearts, who was this guy that claimed to be God? That's why they killed him, because he claimed to be God. They said, oh, that's heresy. You know, we're going to kill you for that.
I love heresy. I was explaining to one of our members who was lamenting that she oftentimes is considered a conspiracy theorist. And I said, well, you know, conspiracy theorist is just another word for a modern day word for heretic. That's what they used to call people in the past, was a heretic. And that, yeah, you're right. Jesus was the ultimate heretic, because his blasphemy was his claim that only God is God. And then people just couldn't handle that, because that is the ultimate blasphemy, that only God is God.
Well, he claimed the Jews at the time, they believed in one God. And they were waiting for a Messiah. If you look in the book of Deuteronomy at the very end, where Joshua actually finished those last chapters, because it was after Moses died, at the very end, it talked about no one has come yet like Moses. They were waiting for that one to come that would fulfill that Mosaic law. The one who never did anything wrong, the Messiah. They were waiting for that since the Old Testament times. But when Jesus claimed to be him, they didn't believe him. They were expecting something else. And here would be people like you were talking about before that were making God into their own image. They were expecting God to do certain things in certain ways. And because he didn't do it in certain ways, well, you can't be him. You're just this, you know, you're not this guy on this white stallion coming in, delivering us from the Romans, which is what they wanted. You're not delivering us from this oppressive Roman rule. Who are you? You're poor, you're this, you're that. And when he claimed to be God, and he said, before Abraham was, I am. And when God sent Moses, and Moses said, well, who do I tell Pharaoh sent me? Tell him I am sent you. I am, meaning the self-existent one, the one who was never created, the one who was always there. I am, he made everything. So Jesus then claimed to be that I am. And they said, this is blasphemy. And from that moment on, they were trying to kill him.
Yes.
So some of those, but he proved who he was. And in the readings, you remember, since you're in a liturgical church, you remember the readings before last week, where he was on the lake, and suddenly this terrible storm came, and he said, "Peace be still." He told the waves, "Peace be still." And even though the winds died down and the waves died down, the whole sea was like glass. And even if you stop the wind, you still have this rocking of the waves. It stopped. And they looked at him and said, "Who is this guy?" They were petrified. Not just the wind and the waves, because they thought they were dying. That's over. But now they were scared of him. You know, who's this guy? You know, okay, he heals people and stuff, but now he's controlling the whole creation. That blew their minds. So God often does things that will completely blow our minds. And again, you know, we were talking about believing different things and looking for different things and truth. It's a good thing to be aware that, you know, in the Bible it says that Satan comes as an angel of light. He comes as light, try to deceive. He's a deceiver. He's a liar. So if there's something that he's encouraging that we might be encouraged to do. Well, if I just rob this bank, no one's going to know, so it'll be okay. Well, you're breaking some basic laws, and there's nothing that if the laws that God has written down, and these are things to, like the Ten Commandments, and of course the Jews made at the time made all these rules around the Ten Commandments so that nobody could possibly break the Ten Commandments, because you had to break about 200 rules to get to each commandment, And so.
Oh, but wait a minute though. So you're saying that they made that so that it was impossible to break the Ten Commandments. Is that what you're saying? Or that it was possible to follow them?
They always did break the Ten Commandments, but everybody does. Everybody did. And when that woman was convicted, when they brought her out, they wanted to stone her, that she was caught in adultery. One, where's the guy? There's no guy. They just brought her, right? And then Jesus starts writing in the ground. And it's assumed that he was probably with his finger, just like the finger of God writing on the tablets, that with his finger, he's writing in the commandments in the sand. And then he says, if there's anyone among you that's never broken these, let him cast the first stone. Because Jesus was the only one that never broke a commandment, even in his thinking. Because he had said to people, you've heard it say, thou shalt not commit adultery, or thou shalt not. But I say to you, even if a man lusts after a woman in his heart, he's already committed that.
I thought it was Jimmy Carter that said that.
Yeah, well, he was quoted for the scriptures.
Oh, that's who I remember saying it.
Yeah.
I don't think Jimmy Carter's in the lectionary.
No, probably not. So what Jesus was saying basically was that, and he said this, that it's out of the heart that all these things come. And so when God is interested in us, in order to change our hearts, he's not a guy that's waiting up there for us to do something wrong, and he's going to beat us up like whack-a-mole. He's going to pound us down. He doesn't do that. There's a spot in the book of Ephesians where Paul had written, let him who steals, steal no longer. And if you said, okay, well, then he ceases becoming a thief as soon as he stops stealing. No, if you follow through in the next verse, it says, let him work with his hands so that he has enough to give. So now the heart of this thief has become the heart of a generous person who helps the poor. Complete transformation inside. So that thief doesn't become a non-thief because he stops stealing. What God looks at is that complete transformation of the heart. And only God can do that in a human being. And Jesus, he would say these things, if you could perhaps not do something on the outside, but if your heart, for example, I would just love to kill that person, he knows that. And he sees that. Yet he still loves us, but he knows that there was no one that did not break even these most basic commandments except for Jesus. And God gave us those commandments knowing we couldn't keep them. So we would see our helpless condition, that we were unable to follow the simplest commands. Don't steal. Don't lie. What 2-year-old didn't tell a lie to his parents?
Interesting.
This is in us. And Jesus knows that. He knows our state.
So Rosemarie, so where is the consciousness in that? Is the consciousness in that we have awareness of this? Is that where the consciousness is for us?
I would say yes, the consciousness would be in the awareness, because if somebody says, I am great, I do everything great, and if anybody doesn't believe that, well, they got a problem. I'm great. So, we would call that person arrogant or self-centered, something like this. I think for those of us who are perhaps more thoughtful about if we really know ourselves, we know our shortcomings, we know the things maybe where we have strengths, where we don't. And these things are not, so that we beat ourselves up with it. My husband was raised in a church since he was an infant. He comes from a line of pastors and all that. But the type of church he was raised in, and he would say himself, I had all these thou shalt nots, all these rules, all these things you can't do. But nobody ever told me what I should do. Just like okay, don't steal. Well, it's telling you not to steal, but the goal is to have a heart of generosity, that you're giving, and that you're giving from your heart, not because you're supposed to, but that you're giving, that's in your heart. And nobody can change a heart but God. But the moment that we become aware that we say, I need this transformation in my life, or I'm always blowing up at my wife and my kids. I don't know what happens. No matter what I do, I just get angry all the time. I can't even control that. He knows that.
Absolutely. Reverend Rosemarie, in the state of Illinois, like I said, we have 1,200 members. What would you offer us? I said we're trying to connect with individual members who have expertise in these areas, and I've never spoke to you before until tonight, but you obviously resonated to me as somebody who had an expertise in this area, and you certainly do. I couldn't be more pleased. I mean, I am kind of a lectionary freak, and I didn't even know that you preached from the lectionary, so that's terrific. But what I recently talked to Darren Bailey, who's seeking the gubernatorial nomination for a governor for the state of Illinois, and he made the offhanded comment near the end of our conversation about how he really felt the churches had dropped the ball in a lot of aspects. What do you think we need to do in Illinois? Do we need to support churches and look for faith communities that are nurturing, or what do we need to do?
Well, one of the things, I mean, and I think, Darren might have been talking about that the churches have dropped the ball. The message of the gospel, the message of personally being transformed and having a personal relationship with God is really very counterculture. And if we go to a church, I remember there was one congregation some friends of ours went to, and the pastor said, I just want to warn you guys, I'm going to say the S word from my sermon. And I'm thinking, wow, he didn't mean that word. He meant the S-I-N word.
Yeah.
So we have to be communicating what God has communicated. Again, he's the same yesterday, today, forever. He doesn't change. And even though our culture might change, he doesn't change. So I would say to folks that are looking for, if you have this consciousness that's been awakened in you, and you say, what am I supposed to do with this? I can go around. I remember before I became a Christian, what's the difference between this church here on this corner and that one on that corner and all of that? And it came about in time that I realized, and like Jesus, when he was talking to Nicodemus, where he said to him, you must be born again. And we hear that phrase, and it might be, a trigger for some folks, and they might say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with it. But for that heart we were talking about, the heart of a thief becoming the heart of a generous man, that is a complete transformation, supernatural creation that God has put in us to make us a different person. So for the first time, we are able to follow his commands. An unregenerate person, somebody who's trying to just obey the rules, obey the laws, is not able to be godly from his heart. It's not in him. And God has to put that ability in us. And if we pray, for example, I would say for the other folks in Illinois, if you pray, if you're out there, if there's a real God person out there and not, a nebulous kind of spiritual force, but if there's a real person out there, and if the manifestation of that person on earth was Jesus Christ, show me that somehow. show me that somehow. And he will show you that. He is faithful. He came so that all of us would know him personally. So if we're going to a church and it feels more like the culture than the counterculture of the scriptures, the counterculture of the Bible, the counterculture of the written word, the spoken words of God, it is, people say, well, Christianity, or some people, religion is a crutch. You try to be a Christian, and if somebody's screaming at you and hollering at you and calling you all kinds of words, that you respond in a loving manner, give that a shot. That is not easy. I'm serious. That is not easy, but that is what is required of us. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. How do you do that in your natural self? It's impossible. And when when those 10 commandments were given, they were given so that we could see we couldn't keep them. It was impossible, even in your thoughts, to keep them. So there's a lot of spiritual things out there. We live in a physical world, but there's this spiritual world out there that we can't see. And of course, we want to be connected to truth, to the creator of the universe, and what he says about us, about our lives, about our calling, what our role is in his creation. Each one of us is made different, and each one of us is called to fulfill a certain role, like an orchestra playing music. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you've got a violin, you've got a cello, you've got piano, you might have a solo, but for the most part, they're all working together harmoniously to create this music. And that's the same thing that God does with us, where each of us are pieces of what he calls the church, his body. Each of us are pieces of the body. You have eyelashes, and somebody can't say, well, eyelashes aren't important, the hand's important. Well, eyelashes are important if you get something in your eye, it's just as important as a finger or as your shoulders. They're all just different. And I would just encourage folks to find your place. If you're near Dunlap, Illinois, come to us, but find your place and look and see if they're speaking from God's word, from the Bible. See if they're speaking the things that have been written and carried down through centuries, or if they're teaching from that.
Well, and also as I'm listening to that, Rosemarie, I'm thinking that, yeah, we as a congregate, we can help make that happen and enact that by speaking up and offering our viewpoint on where any individual church might be going or not be going. So
absolutely,
that's something really to consider. Our group in Illinois is very interested in since we're just starting, looking at how we can gather, what kind of events we might have, and going to church has been important to me. It's historically in our nation, going to church on Sunday is the greatest form of civic engagement for the average citizen, because most people, time, it's a leisure time activity. They don't have a lot of leisure time, and they choose to go to church. It's organized, it's structured, and in general, it provides something. So as we gather here in Illinois, I'm looking to see what we can do and what kind of events we can have. But in talking to you, I'm thinking, well, the average person could go to church on Sunday. That's hitting on a number of the different topics we talked about, and they could maybe bring something to that community from connecting consciousness. Diversity, I love the idea that you talk about. We're all different.
Yes.
And that does not mean we're all part of the same political party. And oftentimes churches do have a lot of division. Like you said, they're either speaking, well, they do run the risk of just speaking to the culture and not the counterculture. So that was a very, very good point. And I think that's something that our members could take to churches and say, in a loving way, I'm not hearing you speak counterculture, I'm hearing you speak culturally. So that was a very good tip. We're obviously going to have another follow-up call, but I'm so glad this is our first call interview, and I'm so glad it was a spiritual, because when I first started with Connecting Consciousness this month, I was listening for the hot topics, and I heard consciousness, I heard election, I heard politics, I heard children and healing, bed beds, a number of topics. Didn't really hear spiritual, when I finally kind of prodded people, they said, well, that's just a given because spiritual is the driver for everything else we're talking about. So I guess it's just fitting that we started with you. And I rolled the dice. I said I didn't pre-interview. I didn't know who you were, but you resonated. And I'm so glad we had this time together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for calling us. Thanks.
Rosemarie, I'll probably cut it off there, but thank you so much. That really is so fascinating. And then where is your church, or what type of church is it?
Well, we were ordained Anglican, but we're also our ordinations are held in independent churches, and we just started this congregation, Church of the Holy Trinity. It meets in our home, actually in a four-season sunroom with skylight and looking out over 10 acres of forested land. So we just started that, and before we came here, my husband and I we did church in an art gallery in Florida, and so if the congregation gets large enough, we'll have to move to a more public place. So, but Dunlap, Illinois, it's just north of Peoria, if you know where Peoria is.
I do know where Peoria is. Well, I was raised as a Lutheran.
Okay.
And I have spent the majority of my life, though, like probably 25 years or more, as a Presbyterian.
Uh-huh.
But I just during the pandemic, I transitioned into the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
So that's the Anglican, right?
Yeah, right. Except they're more conservative. The Episcopal Church doesn't really hold to the scriptures anymore. The leadership in the Episcopal Church doesn't. So
I go to service online at the Washington National Cathedral, and I have to say I really enjoyed it.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds beautiful. We Ed and I, when we moved up to Peoria, we were at a Presbyterian church for several years, and Ed would teach there often. Yeah.
Were you at First Presbyterian?
No, we were at Grace Presbyterian. Brian Chappell was the senior pastor there. And our seminary was at Westminster Presbyterian in Philadelphia.
Yes. Terrific.
And Brian's books were required reading for preaching there. So when we heard that he was here in Peoria, we thought, oh my gosh, we have to go there. And he was just a marvelous preacher. So we really enjoyed that time. And then the denomination called him to lead the whole denomination. So we had been wanting to start a church, and well, Ed had been in interviews with a church in the DC area, and then we really felt like God was calling us to do something here. So, but I was raised Lutheran when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
My family was pretty nominal. They didn't really.
Mine too. My parents, we never went to church together. My mom was Methodist, my father was Congregationalist. My sister and I were raised by my aunt in a Lutheran church. So we never, as a family, never went to church together.
Wow. Yeah, but you're still going.
I will say I like the convention. I do find a very deep spiritual, like I love the lectionary readings, and so many things jump out at me, and I really enjoy that. But I do like the social. I have liked the social.
Yeah.
And I don't apologize for that. And I tell people, you don't need to apologize for that. That's a valid enough reason to go to church on Sunday, just for the social interaction.
It is, absolutely, so that you're with other people. I lived in Germany for a couple of years while I was attending an art academy there, and it took me months to find other Christians because there are not that many Christians there, even though you would think there are, but there aren't. And it just took months to find other Christians. But when we got together, I mean, it was like your family getting together, because we would do things together on New Year's or Christmas, whatever. And it was like this extended family, because you have so much in common that you don't have in common with the rest of the folks that don't even give God a second thought. So, and when it's part of the center of your life, you want to extend that to other people who feel the same way. And it was a wonderful time.
Yeah, it is. I've met many wonderful people, and I've had a great. Even this experience tonight was a great bonding experience, because we have a synergy on the topic. So it's excellent. Yeah. So, well, again, I appreciate that, and I will stay in touch with you. But I said I'm so happy you were my first person, and let me know along the way if there's any other ideas you have or suggestions for connecting consciousness. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank
Have a good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.